I knew something was wrong the moment I turned onto my driveway. My horses were restless, pacing in the corral, and the afternoon sun shone on something that shouldn't have been there, an open stretch of land where my fence used to stand. The entire line of posts was gone. Not broken. Not damaged. Gone. Torn out, stacked like scrap wood, and abandoned like trash on my own property. And stuck in the dirt, fluttering like some twisted victory flag, was a laminated HOA violation notice. The problem, I'm not even part of their HOA. While I was at work, they decided my old, unattractive fence didn't meet their precious aesthetic guidelines, so they rolled in a bulldozer and erased it from the face of the earth. No call, no permission, just arrogance wrapped in laminate. But what they didn't know, what they never even thought to consider, was that hidden beneath my land was something they relied on more than their rules, more than their pride, more than their perfect little view, and they had just given me every reason to use it. Before we dive in, drop your location and local time in the comments, and if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. The thing about living on 80 acres of land is that you get used to a certain rhythm, quiet mornings, the slow crunch of gravel under your boots, and the kind of peace you only get when the nearest neighbor is a quarter-mile away. Or at least that used to be the case. Everything changed the day that shiny gated community sprouted up next to my property like a polished weed. Before that, my world was simple. Most mornings I'd sip my coffee out on the porch, watching the fog roll over the pasture as my horses grazed lazily in the distance. Their breath would puff little clouds into the cool dawn air. The world felt steady, honest, raw, in a way that manicured lawns could never replicate. My fence, old as it was, stood like a loyal guard dog between my land and whatever the world outside decided to become. That fence had been there since my dad's time. Weathered cedar posts sunk deep into the soil rails, stained from decades of wind, sun, and the occasional curious horse leaning its head over to nibble the grass on the other side. It wasn't pretty, but it was sturdy. It did its job. It marked the boundary between who I was and what I protected. Then came the HOA community, those cookie-cutter houses, with the matching shutters, chemically perfect lawns and residents, who looked at my pasture like it was some kind of wilderness documentary that got too close to their comfort. At first I figured we could coexist just fine. They had their world, I had mine. No need to bump into each other. But that's the thing about HOAs. They don't understand the concept of boundaries unless they drew them, and they especially don't understand people who don't answer to them. The first sign of trouble came the previous summer, when a couple of their residents started jogging on the trail that hugged the property line. Most of them were friendly enough, quick wave, polite smile. But every now and then, someone would stop and stare at my fence like it was a personal insult. I once overheard a woman with oversized sunglasses whisper loudly, "That thing really ruins the view, doesn't it?" I just chuckled. If a wooden fence was the worst part of her day, then she was living a life I couldn't even imagine. But of course, behind every HOA lurks a president, a specific breed of self-appointed royalty. Ours was a woman named Caroline Havers. Perfect blonde hair, bright pastel blazers, voice that carried like an emergency siren. She was the kind of person who treated rules like scripture and viewed anything outside her control as a direct threat to civilization. And she hated my fence. The first letter she sent me, yes, a letter, not a conversation, was dressed up like an official document. Your fence creates an unappealing aesthetic contrast with the unified design of the community. I read it twice just to be sure she was serious. I even laughed and showed it to my horse Ranger, who snorted like he had the same opinion. I did. This woman was out of her mind. I ignored it. I wasn't part of her HOA. She had no jurisdiction, no authority, and certainly no power over my land. Then came the second letter, more aggressive, hand-delivered. She claimed the fence posed a potential safety concern for residents using the walking trail. Apparently the sight of a wooden rail fence was so dangerous that someone might trip over their own judgment and fall into grass. I tossed that one in the trash. The third time she showed up at the property line herself, tapping her clipboard like she was leading an inspection. She talked about community standards, cohesive visuals, and the importance of neighborhood harmony. I told her plainly that she had no business on my side of the fence, and she walked away with the tight-lipped smile of a woman making a mental note to escalate. But even then, I didn't think she'd ever dare to actually do anything. I should have known better. Weeks passed and life went back to its usual rhythm. Horses, chores, work. Every so often, I'd see a homeowner peeking over the fence line trying to pretend they weren't looking. The HOA joggers still gave that side-eye glance, like my land offended their sensibilities. But I let it roll off. People talk. Professionals meddle. HOAs. Well, they act like HOAs. One evening, in early spring, I sat on the porch with a cold beer, watching the sun dip low behind the community's neatly trimmed rooftops. For a moment, I wondered what my dad would say if he saw a place like that next door. He'd probably shake his head and mutter something like, "Son, folks with too much free time and matching mailboxes are bound to cause trouble." Turns out, he'd be right. A week later, I found fresh tire tracks too close to the property line, deep ruts in the soil, heavy machinery. I frowned, crouched beside them, pressed my fingers into the dirt. Still soft, still fresh. But when I scanned the horizon, nothing was out of place. The fence stood steady, the posts unbroken. Probably just a landscaping crew taking a wrong turn, I thought. But something in my gut twisted. I shrugged it off and went about my day, unaware of how quickly everything was about to implode. That brings me back to the moment I returned home, when the peace I'd taken for granted shattered like glass. When I stepped down from my truck and stared at that empty stretch of land where my fence had stood just that morning, when my stomach dropped and my blood boiled and the air seemed to thicken around me. Because that fence wasn't just wood and nails. It was history. It was protection. It was a line that said, "This side is mine." And someone had crossed it. Standing there with the sun beating down and my horses shifting nervously behind me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a cold, steady anger. The kind that doesn't burn out quickly, the kind that sharpens instead of explodes. My first instinct was disbelief. Who tears down someone else's fence? Who takes that kind of liberty? How could anyone justify it? Then I saw it. The stupid laminated notice, shiny, smug, proudly stapled to a broken fence post, sticking out of the ground like a gravestone. The words were printed in neat, bold letters. "Fence does not meet community aesthetic guidelines." And for a long moment, all I could do was stare, trying to process how an HOA could possibly believe their guidelines applied to land they didn't own, didn't manage, and didn't contribute a dime toward. Then it hit me. They didn't think. They didn't consider. They didn't ask. They just decided. Decided my fence was ugly. Decided it blocked their view. Decided they were the final authority on anything they could see from their pristine little walking trail. And that was the moment the equilibrium broke. That was the moment their arrogance collided with the wrong landowner. Because while they were busy acting like they owned the horizon, they forgot something fundamental, something buried deep beneath the soil, older than their neighborhood, older than their HOA, older even than their president's obsession with control. They forgot the one thing on my land they needed more than anything else: the well, the one they'd been using for years. And I smiled, not because I wanted revenge for the sake of revenge, but because justice had a funny way of presenting itself. They had taken something from me. I was about to take something much bigger from them. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was furious, though I was, but because my mind wouldn't stop replaying every smug glance, every passive-aggressive letter, every moment the HOA pretended my land was part of their suburban kingdom. I lay awake listening to the soft nickers of my horses outside, the hum of crickets in the fields, and beneath it all the steady churn of resentment settling into something far more dangerous: resolve. Around dawn, I stepped outside, boots sinking slightly into dew-covered grass. The air was cool, the kind of crisp morning that usually calmed me. But today, it only sharpened my focus. I walked the length of the missing fence again, this time slower, studying every torn post hole, every gouge in the soil from their machinery. They didn't just remove my fence, they violated my land. And in the quiet of that early morning, I realized something important. HOAs like that one didn't understand reason or respect. They only understood consequences. I headed toward the corral to feed the horses. Ranger, my most spoiled gelding, greeted me with a soft snort, nudging my arm, as if asking why I looked so tense. I stroked his neck and whispered, "Don't worry, boy, I've got a plan." He flicked an ear like he approved. Animals are funny like that. They always seem to know when something is brewing. While the horses munched their hay, I replayed my interactions with the HOA president, every warning sign I chose to ignore. Her clipped tone, her polished fake smile, her insistence on community standards and visual harmony. I'd always assumed she was just another bored suburban tyrant desperate to feel important. Turns out boredom and entitlement were a dangerous combination. Around 8 o'clock, I grabbed my keys and followed the tire tracks I had seen the day before. They cut through my pasture, slicing across the dirt like scars. Whoever drove through didn't even attempt to avoid my land. They went straight through it as if it belonged to them. I followed the tracks out to the main road, then down a mile or so to an industrial yard, a contractor's staging area filled with skid steers, dump trailers, and crews in neon vests. I didn't see the bulldozer from last night, but the tracks were the same width, same tread, same depth. I pulled into the lot and got out. A big guy with a sunburned neck and reflective glasses was leaning over the hood of a pickup filling out paperwork. I approached him calmly. "Morning," I said. He glanced up. "Help you?" "Yeah," I said, crossing my arms. "I'm the owner of the 80 acres next to Willow Creek Estates. You or your crew tear down a fence yesterday." His eyebrows lifted just slightly, the way someone's do when they realize they're in trouble, but try to play it off. "Depends who's asking." "I just told you who's asking." A few workers nearby paused to watch. He shifted his stance, straightened up, and sighed like this was a mild inconvenience. "Look, man, we were hired by the HOA to clean up a non-compliant fence. Standard job." "Non-compliant," I echoed. "It was on my land." He shrugged. "Lady in charge said it violated their guidelines. Paid us full rate to take it down." "Did she tell you I wasn't part of the HOA?" Another shrug. "Didn't ask. Didn't matter. We just follow the order." There it was, the casual arrogance, the complete lack of accountability, the carelessness that only comes from people who think consequences aren't their problem. "You realize you trespassed," I said quietly. "Destroyed private property." He took a half step back, not from fear, but the discomfort of someone realizing the conversation had shifted into a legal zone he didn't want to be in. "Hey, if it's a mix-up, take it up with them. We got paid. That's all I know." I stared at him, letting the silence stretch. The workers around us pretended not to listen, but every one of them had gone still. Finally, I nodded. "All right," I said. "Thanks for your honesty." He looked relieved, thinking the conversation was over. And technically it was. But not for me. I walked back to my truck calm as a man on a Sunday stroll, but inside something clicked into place like a puzzle piece snapping together. They hired someone to break my boundary. I'd close off something far more important. Driving home, the idea grew until it was no longer just an idea, it was a plan. A slow, meticulous, absolutely legal plan. The well sat on the far south end of my land, down a gravel path shaded by cottonwoods. A squat metal pump house covered the system, built decades ago by my father, with recycled sheet metal and stubborn determination. Inside, a network of pipes and valves fed both my property and, unknown to most, the entire water supply for the HOA's pristine country club pool and clubhouse. Back when the developers arrived shiny and optimistic, they asked my dad if they could tap into the well temporarily until the city expanded the municipal system. My dad, being the kind of man who believed in handshakes more than contracts, agreed on the simple condition that they let us use their newly paved access road. But the municipal expansion never came. The handshake became the system, and as the community grew, so did their reliance on the well they conveniently forgot wasn't theirs. I remembered asking my dad once years ago why he never formalized the deal. He smiled and said, "Because real neighbors don't need paper to treat each other right." And for a long time that was true, until the HOA bulldozed our fence into the dirt. When I got home, the sun was high and the heat was rising, shimmering over the fields. I parked by the pump house, got out and rested my hand on the metal door. It felt warm, almost alive. This little building had supplied millions of gallons of water to that fancy neighborhood for years. It kept their pool blue, their clubhouse running, their kids splashing in the summers. They relied on it without even knowing where the water truly came from. I pulled open the door and stepped inside. The air was warm, humid, from the steady movement of water through the pipes. The control box sat on the far wall, a simple system built long before modern electronics complicated things. My dad taught me how to maintain it. He showed me every valve, every shutoff, every bypass. I could run the whole system blindfolded. I reached out, placed my hand on the primary supply valve, and stood there for a moment. Did I hesitate? Maybe for a second. Then I remembered the empty stretch of land where my fence used to stand. I remembered the smug letters, the invasion, the entitlement. I turned the valve. Just like that, the HOA's lifeline closed with a heavy echoed click. The effect wasn't immediate. That's the thing about wells, they don't scream when you cut them off. They just stop giving, slowly, quietly, like a patient animal conserving energy. By the time I walked out of the pump house and headed back across the pasture, I felt something I hadn't felt since this whole mess started control. And while I went on with my chores, feeding the horses and fixing a loose hinge on the barn door, the HOA's world was beginning to tilt. 2 hours later, their pool filters shut down. By sundown, the water started turning cloudy. And as the sky burned orange over both my land and their cookie-cutter houses, I leaned on my porch railing and watched the distant shimmer of their once-perfect swimming pool flicker strangely under the setting sun. Their guidelines had consequences too, and I was just getting started. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, long before the sun had finished breaking over the horizon. The anger from the day before didn't come rushing back like fire. No, it settled in deeper, colder, like frost spreading over a window. When anger turns cold, that's when it becomes dangerous. That's when decisions stop being emotional and start being deliberate. I pulled on my boots, stepped outside, and let the morning air wash over me. There was still dew on the grass glistening like nothing was wrong with the world. But as I walked toward the place where the fence once stood, the illusion broke. It looked worse in the daylight. The ground was torn up in long, jagged scars. Tire tracks overlapped like angry scribbles. Clusters of splintered wood lay scattered, as if someone had ripped the fence out with their bare hands. Some posts had snapped, others were wrenched from the soil, completely roots of wood still clinging to clumps of dirt. It wasn't simply removed, it was annihilated. I crouched and picked up one of the shredded rails. My father had installed that fence when I was barely tall enough to hold a hammer. It wasn't perfect, but it was part of our land, part of our work. Seeing it broken like that felt personal. Then I noticed something else, a deep indentation in the soil where the bulldozer had rested, and further along the track marks widened before cutting sharply onto the HOA's paved walking trail. They didn't even try to hide the path they used. The arrogance was astounding. The laminated violation notice was still stuck into the dirt, the corner flapping mockingly in the breeze. I pulled it out and read it again. Fence does not meet community aesthetic guidelines. Community guidelines. On my land. It would have been funny if it weren't so insulting. I slipped the notice into my back pocket more as evidence than anything else. Then I walked the full length of the destroyed border again, scanning every detail. My horses seemed to sense my mood. Ranger snorted impatiently and pawed at the ground. They didn't leave the corral, thankfully, but the wide-open stretch leading into the HOA property was a problem I couldn't ignore, not for their safety and not for my peace of mind. I knew I needed answers. Real answers, not the half-truths and condescension I'd get from knocking on a resident's door. So, after feeding the horses and tossing out fresh hay, I climbed into my truck and drove straight toward Willow Creek Estates. I didn't enter the gates, not yet, but I parked near the entrance and got out. A few morning joggers moved along the trail, running parallel to my property. When they saw me, they looked startled, like I was a wolf wandering out of the woods. One woman slowed down as she approached, her eyebrows knitted together. "Is something wrong?" she asked cautiously. "Depends," I said. "Did your HOA remove a fence yesterday? The one on my side of the property line?" Her eyes darted away. "Oh, that. I heard something about a fence cleanup." Cleanup. That word made my jaw tighten. "So you think tearing down a private fence is cleanup?" I asked. I didn't raise my voice, but she stiffened anyway. "I'm not saying that," she said quickly. "I'm just repeating what was posted." She hesitated. "The president said it was a hazard." "Hazard for who?" I demanded. "You. The trail. Gravity." She flushed, murmured an apology, and jogged away faster than before. After that, I didn't bother questioning anyone else. Joggers were pawns in an HOA's game. They believed whatever their leaders fed them. I needed to see the queen herself. So I drove along the outer road until I reached the back entrance to the community, the one closest to my land. And there she was, Caroline Havers, standing with her arms crossed, wearing a bright coral blazer and sunglasses at 8 in the morning, surveying the very path her bulldozer had taken. Perfect. I parked, stepped out, and walked toward her. She turned when she heard my footsteps, and her lips curled upward, not in a smile, but in the kind of expression that said she recognized me only as an inconvenience. "Well," she said, "I was wondering when you'd show up." "Good," I replied. "Then you already know why I'm here." She didn't flinch. "Your fence was a safety concern," she said, matter-of-factly. "And it did not blend with the aesthetic environment we're cultivating for our residents." My hands curled into fists. "It was on my land." She gave a dismissive wave. "Property lines are complicated." "No, they aren't," I snapped. "You crossed them. You destroyed my fence. You trespassed." She sighed like she was tired of explaining simple things to a child. "Look, this community has standards. Your fence was old, uneven, and frankly, an eyesore. Our residents deserve to enjoy the walking trail without feeling like they're passing a rundown farm." The disrespect was unbelievable. "You had no right," I said slowly. "We had every right," she countered. "The view from the trail is part of our managed environment, and anything that detracts from that becomes our responsibility to correct." I stared at her, stunned. "So you think you can control anything you can see? If it affects the overall harmony of our community, yes." That was the exact moment I knew nothing I could say would get through to her. People like Caroline didn't listen. They enforced, they dominated. They believed rules were weapons, and they were the chosen wielders. But what she didn't know, what made the corner of my mouth twitch despite my anger, was that her power stopped exactly where my land began. She turned away, already done with the conversation. "If you'd like to file a dispute," she said coolly, "you can submit a request to the board, but the fence will not be coming back." She walked off, heels clicking, leaving me standing in the dust like some footnote she'd already dismissed. But while she walked away, I wasn't angry anymore. I was calm, too calm, because her words sealed her fate. She thought the fence was the only thing she'd touched. She had no idea she'd hit something much deeper. I drove back home slowly, the plan forming in my mind with every passing minute. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to sue. I didn't need to fight in the ways she understood. I simply needed to touch one valve. As I pulled back into my driveway, the pump house glinted in the sunlight, a small metal building with decades of history and the power to bring an entire HOA to its knees. I wasn't done inspecting the damage yet, though. Before I went to the well, I took another slow walk along the ruined stretch of earth. I wanted to burn the destruction into my memory to remind myself exactly why I was about to do what needed to be done. Ranger wandered over and pressed his head against my shoulder. I scratched behind his ear and whispered, "They asked for this." Then I pulled the laminated violation notice out of my pocket, looked at it one last time, and let the wind take it. The plastic sheet tumbled through the air, catching sunlight as it spun. I didn't need a reminder. The missing fence was reminder enough. And somewhere in that perfect little neighborhood, a crystal blue pool was about to learn that consequences flowed both ways. I wasn't planning to let the anger guide me when I got into my truck again. I wanted clarity. I wanted answers. Most of all, I wanted the truth straight from the people who thought they could bulldoze my boundaries and walk away untouched. And after talking to Caroline, I knew exactly where I had to go next, back to the contractor's yard. Not because I wanted to confront them again, no, that part was done, but because I wanted to study their equipment, their habits, the depth of their tracks. When someone trespasses, destroying your land, leaving their mechanical fingerprints all over your soil, you learn a lot by retracing their steps. Not just to confirm what you already know, but to understand what they believed they had permission to do. I pulled into the contractor's yard mid-morning. This time the place was busier, forklifts humming, men hauling tools, the clang of metal against concrete. The same foreman I'd spoken to earlier spotted me walking toward him and straightened up nervously. "You again?" he asked, rubbing the back of his neck. "Relax," I said. "I'm not here to fight." He didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded slowly. "Look, if you're thinking about charging us, you got to go through the HOA. They hired us. That's how it works. That wasn't why I was here, but I let him talk." He walked me toward the bulldozer they'd used. A mid-size yellow machine parked in the corner of the yard, still caked with dried mud that looked suspiciously like the rich, dark earth from my land. I brushed my fingers over it, confirming the texture, the smell. "You guys really didn't know that fence was on private property?" I asked quietly. The foreman hesitated, shifting from one boot to the other. "Look, job orders come from the top. We get a map, a description, a list of tasks. HOA president said the fence was non-compliant and needed removing. We didn't ask questions. You didn't think to check the property line. Not our job," he muttered. "We trust the client." I studied him, and for a moment I almost felt a sliver of sympathy. Almost. He was a hired hand, a hammer swung by someone else. But even a hammer should know when it's being used to break something that isn't theirs. "Next time someone tells you to destroy a fence," I said, "you might want to make sure it's theirs to destroy." He looked down, the weight of the words settling in. "Yeah, guess we messed up this one." "You did," I said. "But don't worry. I'm taking it up with the right people." He exhaled in relief, but he had no idea what taking it up meant in my world. After leaving the yard, I drove home slower than usual, letting the wheels roll over miles of empty road while my thoughts turned sharper. Everything pointed in one direction. Caroline wasn't just acting on a whim, she was acting with irrational confidence. She truly believed anything visible from her precious walking path was hers to govern, and that confidence meant she would never see the next move coming. When I got home, I didn't head straight to the pump house. Instead, I walked the length of the ruined boundary again, this time paying close attention to small details. Rocks displaced, grass crushed soil, compacted unevenly depending on the machine's turning angle. Every sign, every marking, screamed the same thing. They had zero hesitation tearing through my property. Zero doubt, zero remorse. The kind of people who operate like that are the same kind who panic when the consequences hit them from angles they can't control. And that's exactly what I intended. I grabbed a shovel and started lifting the splintered remains of the fence, stacking each broken rail and post into a neat pile. Not because I planned to reuse them, they were far too damaged, but because order mattered, control mattered, and reclaiming even a small fragment of what was torn from me reminded me that not everything was lost. As I worked, a few HOA residents drifted toward the property line, curiosity pulling them like magnets. They stayed on their side, silent, watching. One man in a tracksuit held his dog's leash so tightly the little terrier cried. Another couple whispered behind their hands, occasionally glancing at me like I was an exhibit at a zoo. Finally, one man cleared his throat and stepped a little closer. "Excuse me," he said, "is everything?" "All right," I let out a short laugh. "Depends who you ask." "Oh," he said awkwardly. "We heard about the fence." Heard what I asked, leaning on the shovel. That it was unsafe. Or something like that. Unsafe for who I asked. The squirrels, he swallowed hard. "Look, I'm not taking sides, okay? It's just, things tend to escalate around here if the board gets involved. There's no board on my land," I said plainly. "There's just me." He nodded quickly and backed away, clearly done with social bravery for the day. His retreating footsteps were fast, uneven, like a man trying to escape the gravitational pull of a conversation he never wanted in the first place. Once I finished clearing the broken wood, I took a long breath and finally walked toward the pump house. There's something sacred about a place built by your father. It's not just a structure, it's a memory made tangible. The pump house was that for me. A small metal building, rusted in the corners, weathered by decades of storms but still standing strong. Inside, the thrum of machinery was steady and familiar. Pipes ran along the walls, the main control box mounted near the back. I rested my palm on the cool metal surface, remembering how my dad taught me the difference between each switch, each valve. "You treat this place with respect," he used to say. "It gives life, it doesn't take it." And it had given life to more people than he ever imagined. That's what made what came next feel justified. I opened the control panel. The hum of electricity and water shifted slightly when the door clicked open. I found the primary supply valve, the one that fed directly into the line running under my pasture and up into the HOA's clubhouse system. I looked at it for a long moment. My dad's voice echoed faintly in the back of my mind. But then I pictured the torn fence, Caroline's smug expression, the violation notice, the bulldozer tracks through soil that held generations of my family's labor. Respect wasn't a one-way street. I grasped the valve and turned it slowly. A hollow metallic thud reverberated through the pipes. Then silence. The water stopped flowing. I closed the control panel, locked the pump house, and stepped back outside where the wind picked up slightly, rustling through the grass as if whispering approval. Now all that was left was to wait. And waiting, as it turned out, didn't take long. Around noon from my porch, I could hear faint shouts coming from the neighborhood. At first it sounded distant, like echoes carried by the wind. Then the sounds sharpened, children disappointed, adults irritated, someone yelling instructions probably louder than they needed to. I didn't need binoculars to know what was happening. I knew the system too well. By evening, the pool's surface would be dull, maybe even milky. By tomorrow morning, it would be green around the edges. And by day 3, it wouldn't just be unswimmable. It would be a biological hazard. Standing on my porch, watching the sun dip low on the horizon, I felt an unfamiliar emotion settle in satisfaction. Not petty revenge, not cruelty. Just the quiet assurance that the scales were at last tipping back toward balance. Actions had consequences. And the HOA was about to learn exactly what theirs tasted like. By the time the sun dipped behind the rooftops of Willow Creek Estates that evening, I already knew the first signs of trouble were brewing on their side of the fence, or what used to be the fence. Water systems don't fail in silence forever. Eventually, the absence of flow creates chaos, especially when the entire HOA's prized recreational jewel depends on it. I finished feeding the horses and lingered in the barn a while, listening to the familiar snorts, the clinks of metal buckets, the rustle of hay. Simple, predictable sounds, nothing like the rising panic that was surely echoing through the clubhouse grounds. Right around sunset, as I headed back toward the house, I saw movement out near the walking trail. Flashlights flickered, shadows clustered together. A few HOA residents stood around the pool fence, gesturing wildly. Even from a distance, I could tell something was wrong by the way they paced and pointed. Humans have a particular body language when the universe stops behaving the way they expect. They look betrayed. A thin smile crept onto my face, not from spite, but from inevitability. This was the consequence they invited the moment they bulldozed my land. That night, as I leaned back on the porch chair with a cold drink in hand, I watched the lights across the neighborhood flicker as crews rushed around the pool area. At one point, I saw someone pry open the pump room door. Good luck, I thought. You won't find the problem there because the problem isn't on your property. The real switch lived right where it always had on my land under my control. I slept soundly that night for the first time in a while. Morning brought everything I expected and more. The sun had barely risen when a chorus of angry voices carried across the open field. I took my coffee out to the porch, sat down, and waited for the show. The HOA pool was no longer shimmering blue. Even from a distance, the water looked murky, clouded like someone had poured chalk dust into it. A greenish tint lurked beneath the surface, subtle but unmistakable. The filters deprived of fresh water had gone offline. Without circulation, algae took its chance to bloom. I gave it 2 more days before the place resembled a nature documentary. Around 8 a.m., a frantic-looking man in khakis and a golf shirt marched toward my driveway. He had a red binder tucked under his arm and the frantic energy of someone whose weekend plans just collapsed. "Excuse me," he called out. I didn't bother standing. "Morning. You live here, correct?" he demanded. "No," I deadpanned. "I'm a ghost who rents the pasture." His face tightened. "This is serious." "Sure," I said, sipping my coffee. "You look serious." He opened the binder, flipped through pages, muttering to himself, then stopped on something he seemed proud of. "The HOA has reason to believe someone has tampered with the community's water supply. There is a complete system failure at the clubhouse. We're investigating." "Good luck," I said, leaning back. He blinked, thrown off. "Are you aware of any issues? We've had perfect water pressure for years. We don't understand where the failure originated." "Maybe you should ask your president," I said. "She seems to know everything about my land." His expression faltered. He straightened the binder. "This is a serious matter. The pool is shut down. Events have been postponed. Parents are furious." "That sounds awful," I said, not even pretending to be sympathetic. He stared at me like he couldn't decide whether to argue or retreat. "Do you deny any involvement? I didn't touch your property," I said truthfully. "Can't say the same for your HOA." He opened his mouth, closed it again, then turned and marched away with a frustrated huff. That was the first knock on my door, but it wouldn't be the last. By noon, the HOA's Facebook group, normally a sanctuary of cupcake recipes and passive-aggressive lawn complaints, had turned into a riot. Thanks to a public page, one resident had forgotten to set to private. I could read everything. "Who shut off the water? Why is the pool green? Why are we paying dues if the clubhouse is closed? My kid's birthday party is ruined. I demand answers from the board. Caroline needs to fix this." Now, each comment was a little sweeter than the close-in last. The crescendo of suburban chaos played out in real time, a symphony of entitlement meeting unexpected resistance. By the second day, the pool looked like a pond in the middle of a swamp. The water's surface rippled mysteriously, not from wind, but from the tiny creatures already colonizing their man-made paradise. Algae spread like wildfire. The waterline stained dark. A foul smell seeped across the walking trail. Nature knows how to reclaim things. HOAs never expect nature to fight back. That afternoon, I drove into town for feed and supplies. When I returned, I found a white SUV parked at the end of my driveway, the same one I'd seen Caroline drive before. She stood there, arms crossed, sunglasses on, tapping her heel like the earth itself owed her attention. Great. She waited until I stepped out of the truck before unleashing her opening volley. "What do you think you're doing?" she snapped. "Living on my land," I said. "You should try it sometime." "This isn't funny," she shouted. "The pool is unusable. Half the neighborhood is furious. There's a smell spreading all the way to the clubhouse. This is sabotage," says the woman who bulldozed my fence. "That fence was an eyesore," she snapped. "But this is unacceptable. You cannot interfere with HOA operations." I gave her a long, patient look. "Caroline, I didn't touch your property. I didn't step foot on your land. But your board decided to tear down something that belonged to me. Without notice, without permission, without legality. It was necessary," she insisted. "Your fence violated. My land I cut in. My property, my fence, my boundaries." She stared at me, mouth tight. Then I continued. "And since you tore down the boundary between us, I decided to draw a new one." "What does that mean?" she demanded. "It means," I said calmly, "that while you were so busy worrying about how my fence looked from your side, you forgot to consider what your pool looks like from mine." She stiffened. "What did you do?" "Nothing to your property," I repeated. "But I stopped giving you something that belonged to me. Something you've been using for free for years." Recognition flickered in her eyes. The well. She knew. And the moment she knew, so did the entire HOA board, because by evening I had 5 more cars parked at the end of my driveway, 3 board members, the clubhouse manager, and some guy holding a folder like a shield. They weren't angry this time. They were desperate. "We need the water back on," one of the board members said with a forced, trembling politeness. Immediately, their tone wasn't the tone of people giving orders anymore. It was the tone of people who finally understood they weren't in charge. I stepped outside, slowly, arms crossed, and listened to them plead. The clubhouse manager rubbed his forehead. "The filtration system is fried. We can't circulate or refill the pool. It's turning into a swamp." "It already is," another whispered. "We can compensate you for the inconvenience," one board member added. "Inconvenience," I repeated. "Your bulldozer plowed through my land and tore down something my father built." "We thought." "That's the problem," I cut in. "You didn't think." Caroline stepped forward, still trying to salvage authority. "We demand that you restore water access." "No," I said simply. Her face fell. "You can't do that." "I just did." Silence. Then I held up a sheet of paper I'd prepared earlier, a fully itemized invoice printed on clean white stock. Fence replacement cost, labor, damages, and at the bottom the kicker, 10 years of unpaid well usage fees. I watched their expressions collapse one by one like dominoes falling in slow motion. "You pay this," I said, "and we'll talk about turning the water back on." They looked horrified, and that was just the beginning of their suffering. The HOA board members stood frozen in my driveway, staring at the invoice like it was written in an alien language. Their mouths hung open, eyes darting across the numbers, each line item hitting them harder than the last. Even Caroline, who normally carried herself with the confidence of a general leading an army, looked shaken. For the first time since I'd met her, she didn't seem to have a script ready. One of the board members, a balding man in a cheap polo, cleared his throat. This can't be right." "Oh, it's right," I said, "down to the penny. You've been pulling water from my well for a decade without paying a cent. It was supposed to be temporary. Your HOA made it permanent, without asking." "But you didn't know," I asked. "You never questioned where the extra water came from. You thought the club pool was magically self-filling." He looked down at his shoes. Caroline recovered first, though, barely. She tried to straighten her blazer, but her hand trembled. "This is outrageous. We're not paying this." "Then you're not getting water," I replied. Her jaw clenched. "You're extorting us." "You tore down my fence," I said evenly. "You trespassed. You damaged my land. You interrupted the safety of my animals. This isn't extortion, it's compensation." The group exchanged helpless glances, murmuring among themselves. Desperation clung to them like a second skin. They weren't used to negotiating with someone they couldn't push around, someone who wasn't beneath their jurisdiction, someone who didn't fear them. One board member, a petite woman with silver hair, stepped forward. She looked nervous but sincere. "Sir, the pool is unusable. Our events are ruined. The community is in uproar. The smell is getting worse. Kids have been complaining of nausea. We need the water back to fix it." "That's not my problem," I said. "But can't we just—" "No," I interrupted. "You don't get to guilt me into solving a mess you created. You want the well, pay for it." They fell silent. Eventually, they retreated to their cars, defeated, promising they'd be in touch. I waved pleasantly and watched them leave, enjoying the sight of their pristine SUVs bumping nervously down my gravel drive. The next 3 days were a spectacle. From my porch, I had a front row seat to the meltdown. HOA landscapers ran hoses from trucks to the pool, trying in vain to replace the water. But without the filtration system cycling fresh well water, it didn't matter. The algae spread faster than they could dilute it. The pool turned opaque, the green deepening into something aquatic and sinister. The smell drifted across the walking trail, pungent and unmistakably swamp-like. Joggers gagged as they passed. Dog walkers crossed the street. Children pointed and laughed before their parents yanked them away in embarrassment. On Facebook, the chaos only escalated. Residents went from irritated to outraged to borderline mutinous. "Who let the pool turn into a pit? Why is it brown now? My daughter came home smelling like a swamp, and the best one. If the HOA doesn't fix this, I'm calling the county." Someone must have taken that threat seriously, because on the 4th day, county health inspector arrived. I watched from the fence line, well, the empty line, where the fence used to be, as he walked around the perimeter of the pool with a clipboard, shaking his head. He dipped a testing strip into the water. It came out black. Black. That takes talent. He spoke to the HOA president, with the kind of tone normally reserved for crime scenes. The next morning, the pool was officially closed until further notice. Giant orange signs were taped across the entrance. Residents crowded around the gate, asking questions, demanding answers, pointing fingers at the board. That same afternoon, as I repaired a loose hinge on the barn door, a white pickup rolled up my drive. I recognized the driver immediately, Bill Harmon, one of the longer-serving board members. Not arrogant, not loud, not blindly loyal to Caroline's crusade for aesthetic domination. He was a quiet man, the kind who looked like he'd rather be fishing than dealing with HOA politics. He stepped out of the truck holding a folder, not the fancy leather kind the board usually brought, but a plain manila one. He approached slowly. "Afternoon," he said. "Afternoon," I replied. He looked around. "Fence looked better when it was standing." "Yeah," I said. "Funny how that works." He exhaled heavily. "Look, I'm not here to argue or accuse or whatever it is the others have been doing. I'm here because the board is in shambles. Half the residents want Caroline removed. The clubhouse has lost thousands in cancellations. Kids need somewhere to swim. The smell alone is enough to drive people insane." And I asked, "And I think we should talk." "We already talked." I reminded him. "I gave you the invoice." He nodded. "I've read it, carefully. And honestly, you're not wrong. We've been using your well, and there's no legal agreement saying we can. Your developer made a handshake deal with my father," I explained. "A deal your community benefited from for years. And we never paid," he said, finishing the sentence for me. Finally, someone who understood. "I'm not asking for charity," I said. "I'm asking for fairness." He nodded again. "I agree. I do. But we're facing a practical problem. The board doesn't have enough in the annual budget to cover your invoice outright. And if we raise dues, suddenly the residents will revolt." "That's not my issue," I said. "I know," he said quickly. "I know. I'm just explaining the situation." For a moment, he stood there quietly, watching my horses grazing in the pasture. Then he said something I didn't expect. "I think we need to treat this like a business relationship. A real one. Not a handshake, not an assumption, a contract." I raised an eyebrow. "Go on. A long-term lease for well access, paid up front, 20 years. Now that was something." "Caroline doesn't like the idea," he continued. "But she doesn't have the votes to stop it anymore. Not after the pool fiasco." "What about the fence?" I asked. "We'll rebuild it," he said. "Exactly how it was. Or better. Same placement, same height. We'll hire a new contractor. One that doesn't bulldoze private property. And damages covered," he said firmly. "All of them." I studied him for a long moment. Bill wasn't like the others. He wasn't groveling. He wasn't demanding. He wasn't pretending the HOA had the upper hand. He was simply acknowledging reality. "Finally," I said, "bring me the contract. I'll take a look." He nodded with relief, but before he turned to go, I added, "And one more thing." He paused. "What's that?" I approved the fence design. He didn't even hesitate. "Deal," he said. When he drove off, I stood alone in the driveway, feeling perhaps for the first time since this whole ordeal began, a sense of balance returning. The HOA was learning their lesson, and they were learning it the hard way. But the best part, the pool still wasn't done suffering. Bill's visit had been a turning point, but the HOA's unraveling was far from over. If anything, the next week pushed their entire neighborhood into a full-blown identity crisis. It was almost impressive watching a community built on manicured perfection dissolve the moment something messy touched it. On the morning after Bill left, the pool situation went from bad to biblical. I woke up before dawn, grabbed my coffee, and stepped onto the porch, just in time to see a flock of birds circling above the HOA clubhouse. At first I assumed they were scavenging for leftover picnic scraps or hunting insects. But as the light lifted and things came into focus, I realized the truth. They weren't circling above the clubhouse. They were circling above the pool. Buzzards. Nothing says your HOA has catastrophically failed, quite like buzzards taking an interest in your swimming area. I chuckled softly, shaking my head. They wanted aesthetic perfection so badly that they bulldozed something that stood on my land for decades. Now they had a swamp in the middle of their neighborhood. A living, breathing, bubbling reminder that nature didn't give a damn about HOA regulations. A little later, as the sun climbed, I saw a group of residents gathered around the pool fence. From where I stood, I could hear shouts, someone gagging, someone else yelling they should call animal control. Then I heard something I'll never forget. "What is that?" the answer. A turtle. Yes, a turtle had wandered its way into their murky green disaster and was happily paddling around like he owned the place. The community Facebook page later referred to him as the intruder. People debated whether he carried diseases, whether he was aggressive, whether the HOA would charge a fee for removing him. Meanwhile, the turtle was just vibing. You'd think this moment would humble them, but no. The HOA doubled down. Around noon, 2 giant water trucks rolled into the community, the kind you see refilling reservoirs or assisting fire departments. They parked right outside the clubhouse, one backing up dangerously close to a flowerbed Caroline herself had bragged about designing. I leaned against my porch railing and watched the circus unfold. Workers unfurled hoses thicker than my arm and began pumping thousands of gallons of water into the pool. I knew exactly how this would go. It had happened before years ago when a pipe malfunctioned. You can fill a pool all you want, but without active filtration and chlorination, you're basically just feeding algae a buffet. Sure enough, within hours, the newly added water became cloudy, mixing with the swamp beneath it. The entire pool transformed into a churning stew of green and brown. Kids gathered nearby, pointing and laughing while their parents argued with the workers. By the next day, the HOA sent out an emergency notice announcing that the pool would be drained entirely. A fresh start, the memo said, as if trying to frame the catastrophe as a spring cleaning opportunity. I watched the draining process from the hill, overlooking my pasture. It took nearly 6 hours. By the time they finished, the pool floor was revealed in all its horror, stained black and brown, coated with a slimy film you could probably smell from outer space. More inspectors came. One of them gagged. Another swore loudly enough that a mother nearby covered her child's ears. And then finally, the HOA reached their breaking point. That evening, as the sky turned pink, a caravan of HOA officials drove up my long gravel driveway again. 3 SUVs this time, headlights cutting through the dust. I stepped out of the barn and wiped my hands on my jeans as they approached, clearly exhausted, clearly defeated. This time there were no fancy binders, no forced smiles, no airs of superiority, just faces twisted with stress, desperation, and resignation. Caroline was among them, though she looked nothing like her usual commanding self. Her hair was frizzed from humidity, and she had dark bags under her eyes. Her coral blazer was replaced with a plain t-shirt and jeans. She looked human for once. Bill stepped forward first. "We've had an emergency board meeting," he said. I figured, I replied. "Seems like you've had a lot of those lately." He didn't deny it. "We want to resolve this." 3 other board members nodded behind him. They looked like they hadn't slept in days. One woman's makeup was smeared like she'd cried earlier. Another's hands shook slightly as he held a manila folder. Then Caroline stepped forward, taking a deep breath. "Look," she said, voice cracking a little, "I may have overstepped." That was as close to an apology as she could manage. It wasn't perfect, but it was a crack in the armor she'd worn for years. "You think I asked?" She shot me a tired glare, but didn't argue. "We'll rebuild the fence," she said. "Even better than before. We'll pay the damages, all of them." I crossed my arms. "And the unpaid well usage," Bill lifted the manila folder. "We're ready to pay. Everything." I motioned to the folder. He handed it to me. Inside were signed agreements, a formal contract for a 20-year well lease paid up front, and a cashier's check so large I had to take a moment to process the number. They didn't just accept the invoice, they accepted the principle. They knew I wasn't bluffing, and they knew their community couldn't survive without the well. "And the fence design?" I asked, looking pointedly at Caroline. "You approve it," she said flatly. "Whatever you want." I let the silence stretch, letting them sweat for a moment. Not out of cruelty, but because respect needed to be earned, and they needed to feel the weight of what they'd done. Finally, I nodded slowly. "All right." Relief washed over the entire group like a tidal wave. Shoulders sagged. Someone whispered, "Thank God." Another let out a shaky breath she must have been holding all day. "But we weren't done yet. I want it in writing," I added. Bill nodded immediately. "Already included. You have sole approval authority for the fence." And I continued, "I want the fence up before the next month ends." "We can do that," he said quickly. "And the landscape damage from your bulldozer covered," he said. "Restored. And no more HOA notices on my property. Not one." Caroline looked like swallowing a cactus might have been easier, but she nodded. "Agreed." Only then did I shake Bill's hand. The deal was sealed. The poor HOA board walked back to their SUVs, looking like they'd just survived a natural disaster. And honestly, they kind of had. A disaster they created with their own entitlement. I watched them leave, then headed back to my porch as the last car disappeared down the road. The air smelled like dust and sage. Somewhere in the distance, the remains of the HOA pool sat empty, its cracked, stained floor exposed to the night air like a monument to their arrogance. Justice wasn't loud. Justice wasn't dramatic. Justice was simply earned. And soon the whole neighborhood would be rebuilding what they tore down. Under my terms, Once the HOA board left my driveway that night, their headlights fading into the darkness like the tail end of a bad memory, the ranch fell quiet again. Not the tense kind of quiet, the good kind. The kind that settles over land when balance begins to return. Ranger snorted softly from the corral, flicking an ear at me as if asking, "Is it over?" "Not yet, boy," I thought, but close. The next morning, the world looked different. Maybe it was just my mind, but the air seemed fresher, the sun a little brighter, the land a little more mine again. I took my coffee out to the porch as usual and watched the HOA neighborhood stir to life. Even from a distance, I could see the aftermath of their disaster. Cars drove slowly past the clubhouse residents gathered in little groups, gesturing with frustration. Someone was yelling, always a fun sign. By mid-morning, a convoy of new contractors came rolling into the HOA. These weren't the reckless bulldozer bandits from before. These trucks were neatly labeled with professional crews who actually took pride in their work. They examined the empty pool, took photos, measured the damage, and shook their heads like doctors diagnosing a patient with 6 different diseases. The clubhouse manager looked like he'd aged 20 years in a week. He followed the contractors around like a loyal but overwhelmed puppy. I saw him clutching a clipboard, flipping through papers, talking frantically into his headset. Every once in a while, he glanced in my direction, the direction of the pump house. I raised a hand in the most friendly wave I could muster. He quickly looked away. Meanwhile, on the walking trail near my property line, small groups of residents gathered at the dirt border where my fence once stood. Some of them looked ashamed, some curious, some resentful, and some, believe it or not, actually looked relieved. Because despite the HOA's supposed unity, there were clearly people living there who'd always thought Caroline went too far. They were just too afraid to say it until now. One woman walking her golden retriever approached the edge of my land and called out, "Are they really rebuilding your fence?" "Looks like it," I said, leaning against a post hole. "Good," she said with surprising sincerity. It was wrong what they did. Her dog barked, once tail wagging. For the first time since this whole mess began, I felt like maybe not everyone in Willow Creek Estates was a clone from the cult of HOA control. By the end of the day, I received an email, an actual polite email from the board secretary confirming delivery of the signed contract proof of payment for damages and a schedule for the fence reconstruction. They even asked if I preferred cedar or oak. I replied simply, "Cedar, 4 rails. Exact dimensions as before. No emojis, no exclamation points, just business." The following day, a new contractor crew arrived at my property line to inspect the site. Their foreman approached me respectfully, took notes, asked questions, and actually listened to my answers, a shocking skill the previous team lacked entirely. He explained how they'd rebuild the fence, replace the gate, and restore the ground where the bulldozer had chewed it up. "Should take us about a week, maybe less," he said. "We'll make it good as new." "Better than new," I corrected. He grinned. "Better than new," and he meant it. While the crew got started marking the line, repairing the soil, and preparing materials, I took a walk down to the pump house. It sat there quietly unbothered, exactly as it always had been. The valve I'd turned remained closed, and the building seemed to hum with a kind of patient authority. My father built this place with sweat and skill and trust. Trust the HOA had shattered. But now, for the first time since the breach, I felt that trust settling back into place, not for the HOA, but for myself. For the decision I made. For standing my ground. Around midday, another HOA official approached the edge of my land. Not Caroline, not Bill, someone new. A younger man, neat hair, expensive shoes, holding a thick binder. He stopped at the property line and called out, "Sir, I'm the new acting president of Willow Creek Estates." I almost laughed. That was fast. What happened to the old one, I asked, even though I already had a good idea. "She stepped down," he said delicately. "Effective immediately. The residents voted last night." "Ah, yes. The ancient HOA ritual of sacrificing the queen to appease the suburban gods." He cleared his throat. "I just wanted to personally assure you that we intend to reset our relationship with you. There will be no further incidents." "Good," I said. "And thank you," he added, voice dropping more sincerely. "I know you didn't have to negotiate. You could have taken this to court." "I still could," I reminded him gently. He swallowed. "Yes. But we appreciate that you didn't." He left shortly after, clearly relieved to escape the aura of responsibility he'd inherited. I watched him walk back toward the neighborhood, shoulders tight, with the weight of cleaning up someone else's disaster. With Caroline gone, the HOA shifted drastically. The online bickering calmed, the threats faded, the panic receded. Bit by bit, they returned to functioning like normal humans again, rather than foot soldiers in a crusade for aesthetic domination. On day 3, the contractor crew began installing the new fence posts. I watched each one go into the ground, perfectly aligned, sturdy, straight. The rhythmic thud of each post driver felt like a heartbeat returning to the land. My land. Ranger stood nearby, flicking his tail approvingly as the rails began to form along the property line once more. As the fence took shape, more residents stopped to watch, offering shy waves or murmured apologies. One kid even shouted, "It looks better now," before his mother dragged him away in embarrassment. By day 5, the entire fence stood proudly again, clean, strong, beautiful, exactly the way I wanted it. The gate was new too, heavy-duty metal with a smooth hinge that swung like butter. The crew even reseeded the areas the bulldozer had torn apart, covering them with hay to protect from wind. When they finished, the foreman walked over. "Well," he said, "what do you think? I gave the fence a solid shake? It didn't budge?" "Looks good," I said. He smiled, tipped his hat, and he and his crew packed up. As they drove away, I stood there for a moment alone, with the new fence and the restored boundary. For the first time since this whole thing began, I felt settled. The HOA had paid. The fence was rebuilt. The contract was signed. The well was now under a formal lease that benefited me more than the handshake agreement ever did. And best of all, respect had been restored. Yet the image of their swamp pool, empty, cracked, stained, remained burned into my memory. A reminder that arrogance always comes at a price, and sometimes that price is paid in green sludge and buzzards circling overhead. That night, I sat on my porch with a drink in my hand and watched the moon rise over the restored fence line. My land was whole again, my animals were safe, my peace was back. And the HOA. They were finally learning to stay in their lane. Balance at long last had returned. Even after the fence was rebuilt and the contract was signed, the HOA's chaos didn't vanish overnight. Wounds that deep don't close just because the paperwork says they should. The neighborhood still buzzed, with tension whispers on the walking trail, side-eye glances toward the clubhouse, complaints about dues, rumors about who voted to oust Caroline. It was like watching an anthill scramble after someone kicked it. Everyone ran in frantic circles trying to pretend nothing was wrong. But something had changed, and they all felt it. The arrogance was gone. The entitlement was gone. Even the joggers, those who once glared at my ugly fence, ran quietly, now offering small nods or tight smiles. A few even looked grateful to see the fence standing again, as if it reminded them of a time before their HOA turned their lives into a swamp-scented fiasco. No one dared to step onto my land. No one dared to leave a notice. And absolutely no one dared to mention aesthetic guidelines within 50 feet of me. The balance of power had been corrected. A week after the fence was completed, I noticed a few strange occurrences. The HOA landscapers, new ones, not the sloppy crew from before, were working overtime. They trimmed hedges, replanted flower beds, pressure-washed sidewalks. It was almost comical how hard they tried to restore the community's image. They could scrub the concrete all they wanted, but no amount of pressure washing could erase the memory of the pool debacle. Speaking of which, the pool reconstruction had begun. For 2 solid days, jackhammers echoed across the fields as workers tore out the stained concrete. Dump trucks carried away load after load of broken tile and sludge-soaked plaster. At one point, I swear I saw a worker pinch his nose with one hand while jackhammering with the other. When the pool was finally empty and gutted, it looked like a sunken crater, ugly raw, a scar on the neighborhood's perfect face. The board tried to pass it off as a major renovation to improve resident experience, but no one bought the spin. Residents remembered the smell, the bugs, the turtle, especially the turtle. One evening, as I drove past the clubhouse on my way into town, I saw a group of teenagers laughing as they took selfies in front of the construction site. One held a cardboard cutout shaped like a turtle. Below it, someone had written, "In memory of the real hero." I couldn't help but laugh out loud. By now, the HOA had fully accepted their losses and moved into the apology and repair phase. Bill came by once a week to give updates, usually leaning awkwardly against his truck as he spoke. "We're voting on new board guidelines," he said one day. "No unilateral decisions, no authority over non-member properties, and no destruction of anything without a full board review." Imagine that common sense finally discovered like a lost treasure. Another time, he said, "Some residents want to install a community garden. Something low maintenance. Something that reminds everyone to respect the land." I raised an eyebrow. "Respecting land is a good start," he chuckled. "Yeah, we're slow learners, but we get there eventually. With Caroline gone, the HOA became almost tolerable. Not perfect. HOAs never are. But at least they stopped acting like colonial governors. They stayed on their side, I stayed on mine, and peace like a shy animal began to creep back between us. Still, one more loose end needed tying. The contract, though signed, required activation. The water valve remained closed until the first payment cleared, until the lawyers confirmed the lease was enforceable, until everything was sealed airtight. I refused to let the HOA wiggle out of anything. Finally, on a warm Thursday morning, the confirmation email arrived, deposit received. Lease terms active, payment complete. I stared at the screen for a long moment, letting the reality sink in. 20 years of guaranteed income, 20 years of legal protection for my property, 20 years of peace enforced by contract, not trust. I closed the laptop and walked down the gravel path toward the pump house. My boots kicked up dust that glimmered in the sunlight. Ranger trailed behind me for a bit before wandering off to find something more interesting to chew on. When I reached the pump house, I paused with my hand on the door handle. For a moment, I remembered what my father told me decades ago. This well connects us to our neighbors. It gives them life. Just make sure they respect the hand that gives. They hadn't respected it. But now, after everything they finally would, I opened the panel, took a slow breath, and turned the valve back on. The metal clicked, the pipes shuddered, and water surged through the system with a satisfying hum. It felt like flipping the switch on a storm. Power restored, balance restored, life flowing again. Years of free usage replaced by a paid contract. Years of entitlement replaced by earned humility. Years of arrogance replaced by a fence rebuilt stronger than before. The next morning, the HOA posted an announcement. The clubhouse pool will reopen soon. Thank you for your patience. No mention of the fiasco, no admission of the disaster. But that was fine. They knew, the residents knew, I knew. That same afternoon, as I repaired a latch on the barn door, a mother and her daughter walked along the trail. The little girl waved at me shyly. Thank you for fixing the fence, she called out. I turned surprised. You like it? It looks pretty now, she shouted. Pretty. Not compliant. Not aesthetic approved. Not regulated. Just pretty. Innocently honest. Her mother added. We're all glad things are calmer now. It's been a month. She didn't say chaos, but her eyes did. I tipped my hat and went back to my work, feeling something warm settle in my chest. Later that evening, I sat in my porch chair with a glass of sweet tea and watched the newest pool crew finish installing fresh blue tiles. The smell of the swamp was gone. The turtle had disappeared back into whatever wild place it came from. And Caroline, rumor had it, she'd moved to another state, somewhere with stricter HOAs. The peace that returned wasn't just quiet, it was earned silence. The kind that comes after a storm finally gives back the sky. And as I watched the sun set behind the rebuilt fence, the hum of the pump house blending with the rustle of the tall grass, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Sometimes the only way to teach people the value of boundaries is to let them watch their own collapse first. When people talk about property disputes, they rarely talk about the emotional toll, the feeling of being violated, of watching something you built with your own hands get torn apart by people who don't respect it. But here's the truth, boundaries matter. Not just fences, not just lines on a map, but the principle behind them. Standing up for your boundaries doesn't make you aggressive, it makes you responsible. This story isn't really about a fence or a pool. It's about respecting what belongs to others and speaking up when someone refuses to. In life, you will always meet people who think they deserve control simply because they want it. But you teach them how to treat you by how firmly you protect what's yours. If you've ever dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or anyone who tried to bulldoze over your rights, drop a comment below. And if you want more stories like this, make sure you hit subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next.